One other thing from the video, and this will actually get us into our topic, and that is this statement from a little bit early on in the video, which is also rather interesting.
We can only imagine what might have happened if things had turned out differently. If different books, like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Epistle of Barnabas, or the Apocalypse of Peter, had made it into the Bible. If different groups, like the Valentinian Gnostics, or the Marcionites, or the Ebionites, had won more converts than their proto-Orthodox contemporaries, we can only imagine what would have happened.
Yeah, we can only imagine the absolute incoherence of what would have happened. There is no question, as we, in the last program, as we spent so much time on the subject of Gnosticism and hopefully helped you to understand at least classical or what's called Sethian Gnosticism to a greater degree. If Christianity had been taken over by these perspectives, these understandings, there would be no Christianity today, just there is no Gnosticism today. And the reason being that something like the Gospel of Thomas is so completely outside the worldview of the apostles and prophets, anything that would have come from first century Israel, anything that would have come from the Tanakh, that it could not have possibly been held together and would be utterly indefensible. And that, of course, was the enemy's purpose in all these things. But you'll notice he specifically mentioned the Valentinian Gnostics. And so what I want to do for the last portion of the program is this will only leave us really with some brief commentary on some other background issues and probably 7 or 8 pages to read in the Ken Wilson dissertation before we can put together a summary statement of why Ken Wilson's very fanciful theory concerning Dupid and the idea that Reformed theology is Manichaean theology, why it must be completely rejected by any serious student of history. And then I would request brothers or sisters in other lands to take what I put together in, I'll put it in various sundry forms. I'll put it in Keynote and PowerPoint and PDF and whatever. We'll make it available for download, and I would desire and ask for others to translate that summary statement and make it available in other languages. The reason being that I was informed on Twitter last week that the popular level Wilson book is coming out in German soon. And so these horrific misrepresentations and category errors and things like that are going to be being promulgated over and over again. And so we want to have a response available to people that demonstrates where the real issues are. And then we can get around to scheduling debates with Dr. Wilson. And I think there needs to be more than one because there's a lot of material there. And I personally think the James 2 issue is also extremely relevant. I think that would be an excellent debate to pursue on the basis of the original language texts themselves on that particular subject. And the fact that I have discovered that I had never heard of Ken Wilson before 2019, I think. Yeah, I think that's the first I had heard of Ken Wilson. But evidently, I don't have it up right now. I guess it wouldn't take a second to do it. It'd probably come up faster than rebooting the program that I was using there. But let me see here. Yeah, right here. I just picked up a book. Wow, I need to. I also picked up a book called Rediscipling the White Church, which is from a Moody prof that's just a primer on social justice. The social justice movement is alive and well on the campus of Moody Bible Institute. It's sad. But this is a book titled A Defense of Free Grace Theology. And this, I believe, is 2017. Let me get to, 2017. Copyright David R. Anderson, Fred Shea, Joseph Dillow, Paul Tanner, Ken Wilson. And this is what it's called Free Grace Theology is anti-lordship, no repentance. Go back to my Wilkins debate from 2005, I think, 4 or 5, if you want to see what that's all about. But Ken Wilson has a chapter in here. Let's see, a theological and historical investigation. I'm sure that probably goes after Augustine at some point. And most of it, at least in this first section, is by Joseph Dillow. Fred Shea, well known from these guys, David Anderson, Fred Shea. Looks like the only thing Ken Wilson, even though he was one of the editors, the only thing that I see specifically being assigned to him is the historical thing early on. So a theological and historical investigation. And something tells me there you go. It took 2 clicks to get to Augustine. so haven't looked at that yet. We will. But this seems to have been written. I'd love to know exactly when Wilson was at Oxford, because this seems to have been written concurrently with all of that, which would, again, I just went to Oxford. I didn't know anything about these guys. No. He had a goal in mind, had a purpose in mind, and pursued that purpose, and that's what we. Look at that, Dupied, location 509. There's Dupied immediately, and let's see. There's Stoicism and Neoplatonism. And then Manichaeism. Well, shock of all shocks. The same old stuff. And so we'll take a look at that as well. But it is interesting that I just ran across that particular information. Had not seen that before. It's not a movement that I really am tracking a lot with. Sort of after the Wilkin debate, it was just like, well, whatever. But they are still out there and they're doing their thing. So we will be able to put that information out. Let me, sorry about the, a little bit of a divergence there, but diversion, I guess, would be the proper term. We talked about Gnosticism in the last program. We spent a long time on it. We emphasized that this is important stuff to know, dealing with all sorts of apologetic issues, not just the subject of Ken Wilson's dissertation in provisionism and defending Augustine against the cavils that he would put forward. Valentinian Gnosticism is, as I said on the previous program, much more insidious, because it is plainly clear that Valentinus, who was born around the turn of the century, so around 100, died by 80, maybe before then. We don't have a lot of information. He may have been from Alexandria, probably, but he flourished in Rome. And that's where he did most of his damage, was in Rome. Valentinus plainly had access to Christian teaching, understood Christian teaching, and sought to create a form of Gnosticism that would be specifically attractive to Christians. He dropped the unusual, strange-sounding terminology that we gave last time in regards to the names of the eons and all that kind of stuff, and instead replaced. It's not that he got rid of the eons. Didn't really even get rid of the numbers of the eons. He just renamed them with biblical names. And so he seeks to create. So instead of the Barbelo, you'll have a biblical term of truth or something along those lines, light and the word and things like this that will be utilized rather than strange vocabulary, because it's clear that what he was trying to do was to develop followers from amongst Christians, like Paul warned in Acts chapter 20. Okay, exactly like Paul warned in Acts chapter 20. That's why I was saying what I was said about the prophetic material before. And so, as I said, they would send their people in to fellowships. They would participate. They would claim fidelity to what was being taught. And then they would start taking people aside. And they would say, well, that was a great sermon, wasn't it? Yeah, that was wonderful. But you know, I've been meeting with this group, and we've been doing some in-depth studies, and we go a little bit deeper on this. Would you be interested in learning a little bit more? And come to our meeting. And the exact same mechanism that the cults continue to use to this day really find their first utilization in the Christian era in Valentinus. He is just the prototypical cult-leading heretic, and he's brilliant. Arius was smart. Valentinus was smart. Falsehood is rarely produced by stupid people. They are very often people who have a very high view of their own intellect, and Valentinus had a very high view of his own intellect. The Valentinians viewed themselves as the enlightened ones, the ones who have received that gnosis. And in fact, in Valentinian theology, they are the spiritual ones. The rest of those Christians are the soulish ones. And then people who don't follow Jesus at all, they're fleshly. And so their idea is to grow the ranks of the spiritual by drawing from the soulish, by imparting to them this gnosis, this knowledge that will raise them up. But in the process, what you discover, of course, is that this knowledge is a fundamental denial of the foundational beliefs of the Christian faith. So what did Valentinians believe? Well, there are a lot of scholars who believe, and there seems to be fairly good reason to believe this. Yeah, there are some interesting things that you can find in the Gospel of Philip, and specifically the Gospel of Truth. Let me see. I don't know why let's see, how do they have this? Yeah, the Gospel of Truth. You can find it in Marvin Meyer's, he did the editing on the Nag Hammadi scriptures. So the Gospel of Truth would be what you'd want to look up. There are scholars who believe that the Gospel of Truth is from Valentinus. And there's at least one Christian source that specifically says the Valentinians had something called the Gospel of Truth. So there's a good reason to believe that. So there would be other scriptures that you would be introduced to at a later point in time. But again, it was so plainly, when you look at what Valentinus does, let's remember the Gnostic myth, the Father of Light, the eternal being, the perfect being, however you want to describe him, begins to have these emanations. Well, what Valentinus does is he uses Christian terminology about the Father, the Son, the Spirit, and it could actually be understood in some ways that it's a form of modalism, that he identifies that one primeval pure being as Father, Son, and Spirit, that these are different aspects of one substance of some type of thing. But he does not have the idea of actual persons who interact with one another, that one can become incarnate, truly take on flesh, that kind of thing. That wouldn't really fit. Those things are all spiritualized in light of the important thing, and that is where does creation come from? Where does the physical creation come from within Valentinian Gnosticism? He specifically recognizes that turning Yahweh into Yaltabaoth is not going to work if you're going to want to specifically infiltrate the church and corrupt the church from the inside. That ain't going to work. So there is a major de-emphasis on anti-Mosaic, anti-Old Testament stuff that you would find in standard classical Sethian Gnosticism. So the God of the Old Testament isn't an ignorant, evil rapist. But that still doesn't explain where creation came from, because here's the important thing to realize. In Valentinian Gnosticism, the one true God, however you describe him, is still not the creator of all things. There is no divine decree. There is no basis for duped. There is none of that is even there. There's no foundation for it. And instead, what you get is you get the Father and the Son, not as separate and distinct persons and homoousios or any of that kind of stuff. That's not a part of what's being even debated about at that particular point in time. Then you get the eons, you get the emanations that are named after biblical, really characteristics of God, attributes type things. But guess what the last emanation is? I'm really tempted right now to give a quiz to Rich to see how closely he's listening. But he'll say he's busy watching YouTube stuff right now, and because that's his job. That's what he'll say. But the lowest eon. So guess what the lowest eon, the last eon in Valentinian Gnosticism is? That's right. Sophia, wisdom. I've just been reminded that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light from the other side of the window. I'll let him explain that on Twitter later on today, which I'm sure he'll want to do, actually. Anyway, so the final eon is Sophia. So you're going, okay, are we going to get Yaldabaoth? And no. And you don't have quite as much, it's still there. You don't have quite as much of the emphasis on the male-female stuff. At least it doesn't seem to be. Remember, we have the descriptions of the enemies of Valentinianism, and we have a few fragments from Nag Hammadi. It's not necessarily sufficient to allow you to answer every question you'd like to have answered about a particular perspective. But anyway, what happens is something does happen with Sophia. But the result is not a disfigured deity of some kind. Instead, what you get, and it's interesting, if you look up Valentinian Gnosticism on Google, there's actually an interesting graphic under the name of Valentinian Gnosticism that is somewhat useful at this point, because it shows Sophia, and it shows Sophia in two Oh, no wonder. It's 2 degrees warmer than normal, and the fan's not on. That explains all of that. There we go. Sorry about that. It was getting just a bit toasty in here. We just fixed all that with ye old cell phone. Sophia is shown in 2 different realms. She's shown in the divine realm, and then there's a part of Sophia that extends down outside of that realm. When Sophia does whatever it is she does, it is described as ignorance. As ignorance. And as a result of this, she leaves the divine realm, and this ignorance, I know this sounds weird, it's the only way I can explain it, coalesces almost into a cloud of ignorance that creates the physical realm. So the physical realm is created out of ignorance of the truth and the true God. And so anything that exists within that realm exists in ignorance. And some of the sources say that there was a co-laborer called error. And in the process, Yahweh comes into existence, but Yahweh is not evil, is not a racist. Racist. Not going to go there on political terms right now, but he is a lower deity. So in a sense, what Valentinus could say, sometimes just called Valens instead of the Latinized version, but what he could say, or what his followers could say in a Christian church was, oh, certainly we worship the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then you get into the meetings and you get introduced to the teachings and you get the gnosis revealed to you, and you discover that there is a God above who did not himself create Yahweh, but it was through his divine power, through Sophia, that Yahweh comes into existence. And Yahweh then creates the physical realm, but it's in this fog of ignorance. So what is salvation then? It's interesting. Again, I mentioned to you last time that I've been listening to this way leftist professor who's very good on the facts. I'm glad that I learned as a young person to listen to liberals and appreciate their ability to get the facts right, and then recognize where they just go right off the edge of the cliff. You can just tell this guy loves Valentinus. He detests Irenaeus. Just thinks Valentinus was, I bet he has a Valentinus tattoo someplace or something like that, because Valentinus was just awesome. And he's just so insightful and everything else. The reality is that Valentinus developed a system specifically to draw disciples away after himself. That's what he was doing. And so remember, what they're trying to do is they're given his audience, instead of the ideas that you have in Sethian Gnosticism about getting the energy of the pleroma or of the upper realm out and back to it. Instead, what you have in Valentinian Gnosticism is this idea that you've got a part of the truth. We're going to give you the rest of the truth, and that truth will set you free. And salvation becomes learning this knowledge that you are much greater than you think you are, which has always been a great religious, I mean, that's what mankind's religions are always about. Is it's not that there's a holy God that you owe anything to, or you violated his law or anything. No. That's far too prosaic. Instead, Valentinus presents this idea that salvation is coming to know God, and by knowing him, you're in essence absorbed back into him in sort of a metaphysical type of spiritual concept. And so, now all the Gnostics had this, and Valentinus had to be very careful here. But I'm not sure if I mentioned this yesterday, but the Gnostics had the idea that the garden scene and the fall, completely misunderstood. The Gnostics said it was because Yaldabaoth, via Moses, deceived everybody. Valentinus had to spiritualize that. But the idea is in both that the fall was a good thing, and that it was Jesus, or the Christ Spirit, or the Son Spirit, that, not Satan, that was seeking to free mankind by partaking of the fruit. In one of the, I'm not sure if it's in there, but in one of Valentinus's poems, and it might have been the Gospel of Truth, but I'm not 100% certain, it is said that he was put on a cross to become the fruit of knowledge, the fruit of familiarity with God. And so Jesus doesn't die to forgive sins. Jesus gives himself, and probably only in a spiritual sense, so that we can have knowledge of God. And therefore it was he, the Christ Spirit, who in the garden wanted mankind to partake of the fruit, so that they could, so you could have, you could know who you really were. You would have the tree of knowledge. You need, that's gnosis. You need to have that knowledge. So the whole idea was, and I can't tell you how Valentinus would answer the obvious question that would immediately come up. If you were a Christian, you had been, you had, with pure motives, come to this meeting. You've been interested for a while. It sounds interesting. And now all of a sudden they drop this bombshell on you that what you've been taught all along about the fall and about the role of Satan was wrong and far too simplistic. And that, in fact, partaking of the knowledge, the tree of knowledge was a good thing, and that this was what the Christ Spirit wanted. You would think that, sort of the first question that would be asked by a Christian would be, but wait a minute, then how do you then deal with the entire narrative of the Bible that is written in light of what happens in Genesis 1? I don't know how he responded. There probably be some very, very well thought out, spiritualized way of getting around the plain meaning of the text. And given that Valentinianism didn't start, it started before Origen, but it continues to flourish after Origen. Origen's influence would have only damaged the ability of the church to fight against that because of his allegorical interpretation, which moves the church, not everybody in the church, but many people in the church, away from a grammatical, historical interpretation of the text of Scripture. But the Christ Spirit then is involved in that partaking of the fruit. And salvation then is this taking in of knowledge of God and this personal relationship. And you could say it's through Jesus, but it's not through the historical Jesus in a mechanism of providing forgiveness of sins and imputed righteousness or anything like that. It is a Christ Spirit enlightening you as to your true nature. Now, if you're thinking, that means that same Spirit has been active for a long, long time. If you're familiar with any of the Theosophy or Christian Science and all the rest of this stuff, they've all drunk deeply at the well the same kinds of things. And so even when there were enough Valentinians to form their own fellowships, they would look very, very much like the Christian church. They would have baptism. They would, but when they would do baptism, it would have a different significance. The taking off of the robe, the old life, sin, washing, new robe. Instead, this is taking off ignorance. And salvation is a Gnostic. It's a obtaining of gnosis. And I couldn't help as I was reading this stuff. It's been, oh man, how long? It's the late 90s here in the Phoenix area. He's still active. There was a guy and he's still amongst Reformed people, who took his church off into this strange stuff about how mankind never sins purposefully, but only in ignorance. And that the central emphasis of biblical revelation is the knowledge of God. The knowledge of Yahweh will fill the earth, and therefore that's really what brings about the end, is the filling of the earth with the knowledge of Yahweh. And so the whole idea that you never sin purposefully, that it's not an act of will, it's an act of ignorance. You just don't know better. I couldn't help but while studying Valentinian Gnosticism going, oh, wow, that's a rather intriguing connection, because it really does totally change the whole concept of the forensic nature of justification, the forensic nature of the law court scene that we have in Romans chapter 8, and the mediator, and all of those things. It really removes the sin aspect and turns it into you just don't know. And that's why the Valentinians had debates amongst themselves as to, if you die as a soulish person rather than a spiritual person, so as a regular Christian that hasn't obtained the gnosis, what will happen to you? And there were some who felt those people were lost, and then there were others who actually had some type of a concept where the God of this world, Yahweh, who is not the supreme God, that possibly they might live in that being's presence after the final dissolution of all physical things, because physical things actually don't have any real being. Only those things in the pleroma, in the fullness, have true being. And so at the end, and this is the same in Sethian Gnosticism, it's the same in Valentinian Gnosticism, and it's the same in a sense in Manichaeism. In your eschatology, eventually the physical realm is done away with. There is no physical realm. And so clearly the idea of resurrection, as Christians understand it, and the new heavens and the new earth. A lot of Christians have, let's be honest, a lot of Christians have the idea that the new heavens and the new earth, it's pretty much just a spiritual thing too, right? I mean, a lot of people think that way. So what is important, let's make immediate application because time's running out. We're only going to go an hour today. Sorry, just the way it is. But in regards to the idea of there being a meaningfully consistent connection between Gnosticism, and now we see all the different kinds of Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Stoicism, the community at Qumran, Neoplatonism, that then is communicated via Augustine's alleged adoption of his former Manichaean perspectives, then the miraculous transmission without alteration or development from Augustine directly into the mind of John Calvin, And from him directly into each one of our minds today, 500 years later, the whole dupied concept is plainly unsustainable on any logical or rational basis. The reason being that that which is definitional of Reformed theology in regards to the decree of God cannot exist in any of those systems. There is no deity of sufficient personality, power, activity, sovereignty in any of these systems to have a divine decree that determines the very fabric of time. The forms of determinism found in those systems all differ from one another, and they differ on a level that categorically makes dupied utterly unsustainable and to be rejected by anyone upon any close examination and consideration of the actual issue. That's the first thing to point out. Secondly, that time period, I mean, think when Valentinus is born, as the last disciple's dying. John may have just passed away, and Valentinus is born. And that was a truly tremendous period of time as far as challenge for the church. Really, really was. It has surprised me more and more as I've been dealing with this, how rarely we give consideration to God's goodness in having protected divine truth during that time. But then when you think about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you think about I think it's 2nd John. Is it 2nd John? What is that reference? Yes, there it is. 2nd John 2. Let me just read the first two verses. The elder of the chosen lady and her children whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, for the sake of the truth which abides in us and will be with us, eis ton iona, forever. The truth will abide amongst us, plural, in us, and will be with us forever. This is the promise of the apostle in 2nd John verse 2. This is written right before what seems to be one of the greatest challenges that the church has ever faced. And it just strikes me that there's much that we could learn from that. And one of the things that I have learned from that is to be thankful for God's faithfulness to preceding generations. In our modern day, we look down upon those who came before us. We diminish their accomplishments, their faithfulness. We have so much more than they had. And yet, they fought one of the greatest battles in the history of the church with weapons significantly less well-armed than what we have, but had the same spirit. That's the important thing. Had the same spirit. We can have all the knowledge in the world, but without spirit, it's not going to accomplish anything. So my appreciation for men like Irenaeus has grown tremendously as I have considered just the devilishness, the deceptiveness of Valentinian Gnosticism and the systems that sought to draw disciples away after themselves. That's exactly what it was. That's exactly what happened. And what a battle it was. What a battle it was. And it wasn't won by some silver-tongued orator. The other side, Arius was a great singer. He wrote songs. Valentinus was a great orator. And they still have their followers today, but not the followers of the truth by any stretch of the imagination. So that's always something to keep in mind God used plain old people committed to the truth, steadfast, and they prevailed. They did prevail. So with that, there's only a couple of other comments to get to. There are two sections, but the conclusion, there's a concluding section to one of the chapters, and then the conclusion of the dissertation to work through, and then we'll make the presentation that we will then put out and make available to anybody. Anybody can take it, just don't edit it, just translate it, make it available, because we want to provide a counter documentation. And so in that presentation, I'll be going through examples of the errors, providing examples, counter argumentation. This is why this thesis simply does not work, and we want to get that out there as well.
By the way, I've been listening to all the Manichaeism Dupede programs, and I'm looking forward to seeing it all wrapped up.
Everybody's looking forward to seeing it all wrapped up. I'm sure Ken Wilson is really looking forward to seeing it all wrapped up too. So so am I.
In all seriousness, not because I haven't enjoyed it, but because we're coming to the end.
Yes,
this is the home stretch run.
Got to get there sometime. Yeah, definitely.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks for your call.
Wright.
All right, God bless.
All right, bye-bye.
I had at some point over the past 3 weeks started reading through. Once again, I've already laid this out. There is a conclusion section in, if you're new to the program for some reason, we were challenged by a group that calls themselves provisionists, who seemingly have become very deeply connected with the free grace, anti-lordship, anti-repentance movement, to respond to a book, which has moved all the way over here, to a book titled The Foundation of Augustinian Calvinism. Well, actually, we had people calling about this book initially. And so when I got hold of it and I listened to it on a ride one day, it's not very long. It's only less than 118 pages. Fairly non-dense print, so it's not long. Well, as soon as I started pointing out problems in it, just errors in argumentation and things like that, we got pushback that said, no, that's not for scholars. What you need is Kenneth Wilson's dissertation. Well, I had looked it up, and it was nearly $100, and I'm like, given what I was seeing in the book, I was like, I don't know that I want to spend that amount of money given the argumentation I'm seeing. Well, Dr. Wilson sent it to us, and once I started seeing what the dissertation was about, then we bought the dissertation online. We bought the electronic version so that at least Dr. Wilson gets his money for that. And we were challenged. We were told no one can respond. This man is the greatest living expert on Augustine in the world. No one knows more about Augustine than he does. He got a DPhil from Oxford for this dissertation, and you guys can't touch his 10-foot pole. So we have been spending a fair amount of time touching it with the 10-foot pole and poking holes through it that are about 10 feet wide, because it is very poorly argued, very poorly written, very poorly argued. It is a theory that, to my knowledge, commands almost no following in scholarship at all. It's not that accusing Augustine of Manichaean influence is anything new. That took place during his life. And someone pointed out that, remember Steve Gregg? That's one of Steve Gregg's big things, is he goes after Augustine for being a Manichaean and all the rest of this type of stuff. So that's nothing new. But what is new is the specific application of a concept called Dupede. And it's basically the theory that Augustine, once he began arguing against Pelagius, Augustine had two major controversies in his life, some minor ones, but two major controversies in his life. This is something I've been lecturing about for years. The first is the Donatist controversy, which is about the nature of the church, the authority of the church, sacraments, things like that. That's when he is first elected bishop. This is something he has to deal with a great deal. And then you had, toward the end of his life, the Pelagian controversy, where he is involved in the battle with Pelagius over the nature of the will and things like that. The theory is that so as to fight Pelagius, not only did Augustine develop a never heard of before baptismal theology, and this is clearly untrue from any meaningful study of church history, but that he also went back to a Manichaean understanding of this dupi, this divine unilateral predestination of individuals' eternal destinies, and that then was basically a direct line straight to Calvin and to Reformed theology. With the result that, and I have this, I just have this sitting on my desktop so that anytime I need it, we can just simply play it. Here's an interview from 2018 with Leighton Flowers asking a question of Ken Wilson. Listen to what Ken Wilson's response is.
Say that Augustine was the first to clearly articulate these views. That coupled with what you found, it seems to be an insurmountable argument against a more deterministic understanding of the text.
Yes, if you want to remain a traditional Christian. If you want to go be a Manichaean Christian with Augustine, then it's fine to take a deterministic view. But for a traditional Christian, you should hold a free will view.
So you have something called a Manichaean Christian with Augustine, if you are a Calvinist, if you're Reformed. And you'll notice that Leighton thinks that this understanding of the early church somehow becomes the lens through which exegesis is to be done too, which is an extremely problematic element of this that we've only touched on a little bit, but it's there. So more and more people, not only in the English-speaking world, but it's getting elsewhere, are now touting this as, see, I'm not going to listen to what you have to say about Reformed theology because you're just simply a secret Manichaean. And so over the past couple of months, we have been doing what almost no one else has been doing. There's been a couple Lutheran guys who have been especially focused upon the sacramentology issue, baptism issue. I've been much more focused upon these issues, but in reading the dissertation, have encountered just numerous problems that we have been documenting over the past period of time. Along in that period, I have identified two sections of the dissertation that we need to finish reading through and responding to. They're both conclusions. And the first is the conclusion to chapter 1. And in chapter 1, you have the philosophical religious context of Augustine, where you have a discussion of Gnosticism, Stoicism, Cicero, Judaism, which would include the Qumran sect, that is how you say Qumran, Neoplatonism, which would, it's a later development also around the time of Augustine, and then Manichaeism. And so we have spent a great deal of time explaining Gnosticism, Valentinian Gnosticism, Manichaeism. You've learned, I talked to a friend who said this morning he feels like he has a PhD in Gnosticism now from listening to The Dividing Line. And look, if you have listened to each one of these programs, you have learned much more about Gnosticism, Valentinian Gnosticism, Manichaeism than 99.98% of seminary graduates in the United States. There is no question about that. If you are studying church history, then no, you're going to have to go into more depth than that. But for the vast majority of people who graduate with an MDiv or something like that, they take one, maybe two church history classes. I can assure you, you have now heard much more about these. We spent not only that, but in the vast majority of seminary classes, you don't have time. You may be assigned some stuff, but we have read through portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the hymns that were found there to, again, reading what Wilson said, going to the source itself, and then saying, is that an accurate understanding, and providing a response to that. What I want to do is I want to finish up reading the summary, the conclusion to that first chapter, and then looking at the conclusion of the dissertation itself that ties all of these threads together. Because a lot of the argumentation in the dissertation is about editing that Augustine made to his own books, and when certain portions of certain books would have been written, and did he go back and change things and stuff like that, that, to be honest with you, I'm not going to invest my time in while working on my own PhD at this point in time, because it's not relevant to the abuse of history that the Dupied theory, and that's his own choice. He said, he coined that phrase, so, and he uses it hundreds of times. When I first got the PDF, I thought I knew exactly how many because I just put the phrase in. Because of the use of the M dash, it's hundreds of times, over 200 times in the dissertation. He uses that phraseology. That's his phraseology. It is the abuse of history that represents, the inaccuracy that it represents, the fact that it's an indefensible concept that we have wanted to be focused upon. So, with all of that, I continue on page 37. I've started 35. We've looked at things. Just looking at 37. Stoic providence was a micromanaged predetermination of every detailed cosmic event. Cicero, or you've heard also pronounced Cicero, there's different ways of pronouncing Latin, achieved compatibilism by limiting providence and rejecting divine foreknowledge. He simultaneously embraced both fate and free will by conceiving a direct divine intrusion into the human mind, manipulating the inept fallen will to a correctly reasoning will, thereby allowing a, quote, free choice, end quote. According to Alexander of Aphrodisias, the Stoics, especially Chrysippus, developed the theory that persons are incapable of choosing freely, yet despite this lack of choice, freedom to choose remains with each person. Translating this into modern terms, redefined free will achieving compatibilism remains despite being chained to compulsion, non-free free will. Now, I have complained about the clarity of the writing all along. I complain about it again. But the point is that I will not sit here and pretend to be an expert in Stoicism. There are very few people who really are. You have to be a hardcore philosophy type guy to want to invest the energy to really come to grips with the various forms of Stoicism, because as with any philosophical system, Chrysippus might represent one form of Stoicism, but there were others. Especially when we look back in history, you might have, we have to be really careful about this, because you might have one person whose writings have somehow survived, and because of that, we have him define that position. If you had lived at the day, you might have realized that guy, well, okay, he's written some books, but he wasn't nearly as important as this other guy who actually really does define that position, but his books don't survive for 2,000 years, and therefore we end up with a skewed understanding because of the nature of the sources. Anyway, let's just be very clear here. Stoicism does not have a sovereign decree of a personal God. The deterministic elements of Stoic philosophy are mechanistic. They are due to the nature of the creation. And even at this point, when you start, look it up. If you don't believe me, go to the Google Scholar, put in Stoic determinism, Start reading a few papers, and you'll go, oh, it's because there is a completely, when I say a completely different cosmology, it's not the differences between Manichaeism and Gnosticism and Valentinian Gnosticism and different myths and stuff like that. No, this is a completely different way of looking at reality itself and the relationship of mind and matter and all of this. And so when the Stoics made the assertion that what is has to be the way that it is, their reasoning is not because there is a divine decree that determines people's individual destinies. There's nothing personal about that. And it's not just fate. It's not some simplistic idea that there are fates running around that determine it either. And it's not a modern scientific idea that, well, because of your genetics or because of the rules, the laws of nature. It's not even that. It is much more complex than even all of those things. But it would be more in that realm. It would be more the natural result of laws than it would be any type of expression of divine will by any stretch of the imagination. Now, those laws are extremely complex and don't really map with how you and I look at the world. That's why I would say trying to explain Stoic cosmology is just as difficult as trying to help Westerners understand the Eastern way of thinking when we're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy and stuff like that. Because when you're talking to an audience that just doesn't, we don't have that kind of background to draw from, it's hard to come up with illustrations. We can't learn by analogy. The foundations are very, very different. So, but what we see again with Wilson here is he takes the modern terminology of determinism, decrees, choosing, free will, things like that, and he's clearly seeking to forge connections to what would be today Reformed theology, rather than letting the Stoics speak as the Stoics and defining the terminology within a Stoic framework, which is very, 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 very different. That's not explained here. But you end up with this non-free free will, which is meant to be a mocking term. But it's Augustine's conversion from traditional free choice to non-free free will is the title of the work. Because very clearly he does not believe that can be made a meaningful concept. So the whole concept of compatibilism, the whole concept that you can have a divine decree and yet that creates time itself where man's decisions are meaningful, he just rejects its possibility. But the Stoics didn't do that in the first place. They did not have a personal God who had a revelational decree of himself to his own glory. It just wasn't there. Just not a part of the system. So I continue on. Although some scholars categorize Stoics as compatibilists, determinism and moral responsibility are inseparably linked, presupposing and demanding each other. Notice that's a criticism. That's his perspective. Concealing fated free will. That sentence doesn't even really make much sense. Fate controls every minuscule event or occurrence in the universe in a moral imperative. Although the person had no possibility of actuating an opportunity, free will remains solely by definition. There are references given to each one of these that no explanation is provided as to how these references are meant to turn these sentences that don't have any relationship to the sentence before into anything meaningful. The whole dissertation is like this. The section on the dating of Augustine's edits isn't. That's actually better because you're not dealing with this type of stuff. But anyway. The ancient Indo-Mesopotamian religion, the Qumran community, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, and Neoplatonism all embraced similar divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies concepts. Well, so this is why I wanted to, this is central to the affirmation, the assertion. If you want to know what underlies the sound file I played a few moments ago, here it is. and it'll be repeated in the final conclusions. That's why I'm letting the original sources speak here. The original source in this case being Wilson himself. So, if you've been enduring up till now, try to tune in, because this is key. This is really, really central. This is where he's actually laying it out. So you have Indo-Mesopotamian religion. You have the Qumran community. You have Gnosticism. There are lots of different kinds. You have Manichaeism, also different kinds. You have Neoplatonism. All embraced similar dupied concepts. Well, what are they? Number one, humanity's fall occurred by free will, after which free will was lost. This is false. It's false. It's like saying the Arizona Cardinals have won the last 5 Super Bowls. False. This is just humanity. We've already pointed out, to even use the term fall, to use the term free will, given the differences between these groups. I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to about Indo-Mesopotamian religion, unless it's the earlier forms of what feeds into Manichaeism. But if you are the result of the mating of demons who grew out of sperm and aborted things falling on the earth from divine beings that got sexually excited by an androgynous being from the realm of light. I'm sorry, that's not the fall of Adam and Eve. There's no way to make a connection here. This is violation of every logical category problem that man's ever seen. Wow. So that's not a free will fall. And in fact, in Gnosticism, Manichaeism, in Valentinian Gnosticism, the actual taking of the fruit is a good thing. The Christ spirit is sent because gnosis is a good thing. So number one in the definition of dupied, none of the people who held any of these views would have agreed. Well, maybe the Qumran community. Maybe the Qumran community. I suppose that'd be one. But none of the rest of them would even have a category to even work with. Number two, unavoidable, divinely fated actions remain punishable. Again, just looking for a meaningful way of understanding these statements. That would be true of Qumran, because it would be true of Qumran without the word fated. That's a prejudicial term. Fate is impersonal. A decree is personal. I don't care if you don't want to utilize, if you don't want to recognize those differences, the differences actually exist. But unavoidable actions remain punishable. This confuses the eternal and the temporal on the Christian level. Leaving all those things aside, how do you even have a meaningful understanding of punishable between these different perspectives? Punishable by whom? When in Manichaeism and in Gnosticism, the physical realm at the end of time is destroyed, either after all the light particles are removed or whatever other strange forms of eschatology Valentinianism had, and whatever. When the physical realm is dissolved in Gnosticism, it's in Manichaeism, it's not dissolved, it's just separated from the realm of light back to the way things were, because they're two equal realms. How is that punishment? How is that punishment? Punishment on the basis of what? You see, the only way that for punishment to be relevant is if there is an overarching law that governs all of this. You don't have that in Gnosticism or Manichaeism. It's just not there. I'm not sure how the Neoplatonists would deal with this, to be honest with you. Or if they would even have a basis for the concept of punishment in that way. But unavoidable, divinely fated actions remain punishable. That would be understood by each one of these groups in a completely different fashion and would be rejected by Reformed people entirely because of its aberrant assertion. Number 3, by the way, there are 5 points. And in fact, the 5 points would be huaat. See, they couldn't even come up with a tulip. I mean, at least we can come up with nice flowers. They have huaat. Sounds Klingon. We really didn't need to bring a completely different topic into this particular subject. It's tough enough to keep the Neoplatonists and the folks, the Essenes, going, but throw in Worf and we've lost all of it. So number 3, a scare quote dead will scare quote required God's extreme grace to resurrect dead souls in order for the unilaterally predetermined elect to receive salvation. Once again, a surface level attempt to take a bad representation of modern Reformed theology and read it back into ancient perspectives, none of whom could have understood what was being said. All of whom would have defined the key terms of this tortuous sentence in completely different ways. So, dead will, what would a dead will mean to a Manichaean over against a Sethian Gnostic, over against a Valentinian Gnostic, over against a Neoplatonist, over against the Indo-Mesopotamian, over against one of the Essenes? Each one would define the nature of man differently, will differently. To say dead will, how do you define that? When are we talking about the fragment of light? Is that ever dead? What about amongst the Gnostics? Is the result of Yaldabaoth's exercise of divine power he received from his mother Sophia able to create a true soul? Why does Yaldabaoth seek to rape Eve to get the divine power from her? How does that relate to then the nature of Adam and Eve and their wills? And it's a transparent effort to find completely bogus parallels. This is the same stuff that is used, mentioned this yesterday, the same type of argumentation is used to try to draw parallels to the Jesus story that you'll find splattered all over the internet, on YouTube and everything else, proving that Christianity is not unique, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the same kind of reasoning that's being used. God's extreme grace. You could not provide a meaningful connection between what that would mean to Calvin and Augustine back to the Manichaeans, the Gnostics, the Valentinians, the Neoplatonists, or the Stoics. They would have no idea. The community at Qumran, because they have God's scriptures, and they actually believe God's scriptures, they would have a foundation for an understanding of that. Definitely. The rest of them wouldn't. Number 4, although scare quote offered scare quote to all, only the elect could receive faith as God's gift. Again, meaning of elect, completely different amongst all these groups. Faith, different definition. What does it mean that it's God's gift? Why did lots of church fathers before Augustine believe that Ephesians 2 said that faith is God's gift? These are questions that must be asked, but although, quote, offered to all. This is, again, is a very poor effort to read Reformed theology, a badly framed Reformed theology, back into this context to create the very connections that then he goes, voila, look at all my study. Look at these connections. Yeah, he started with them. He asserted them from the start. There was no meaningful argumentation before this in the summary statements that actually establishes any of this stuff. It's just simply asserted. It's a bunch of assertions. And my understanding of scholarship may be different than other people's, but my understanding is when you write a doctoral dissertation, you actually have to back up what you're asserting and argue for it in a meaningful and consistent fashion. So, finally, number 5, the one/God/Redeemer infuses the gift of love, instantaneously resurrecting dead wills. When he gave what he commanded, God could command what he willed. Now, the last two phrases are a paraphrase of Augustine. So, if you're paraphrasing Augustine as a part of what all these other groups allegedly believed, you haven't established that yet. You have not established a similarity of terminology, that this summary would actually be meaningful in any of these. Haven't established any of that yet. But when you actually paraphrase Augustine and then make that a part of your opening summary of the first chapter, then you're going to supposedly argue for it later on. That's called arguing in a circle. Okay, you've already made your conclusion, and shockingly, you're going to come to the same conclusion at the end of everything, too. How did that work? Oh, well, it's because it's not being argued appropriately by any stretch of the imagination. So the one God Redeemer infuses the gift of love, instantaneously resurrecting dead wills. How does that happen in Gnosticism? Well, and it would be different between Sethian Gnosticism and Valentinian Gnosticism. So how does that exactly work? I don't know. I don't think they would have understood anything that was being said there. And even if you could come up with a way to make it relevant to them, that would require changing the meanings of the words so it's no longer relevant to Reformed theology. Trying to maintain this connection is simply impossible. It's not done here. So there is the assertion at this is page, under the conclusion, this is page 37. I'm sorry, page 38. And this is definitional to what the rest of the work is going to be, what it's going to say. And it's simply wrong from the start. Foundationally corrupt. Foundationally corrupt. These are impressive commonalities in sharing Stoic-type providence and divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies. Well, no, they're not, actually. They're fake. You may assert them. You haven't grounded it. And there are so many obvious category errors that, again, most of us are just sitting around going, did anyone read this? What happened here? I don't get it. Christian heretics empowered Gnosticism. Valentinian, which should be Valentinus, appealed to Scripture, Romans 11, proving God offered salvation to all, but only the elect with freed wills could receive it. Only the elect with freed wills. So are you connecting the spiritual with the elect over against the sukakos? Because, as I pointed out yesterday, there was actually discussions amongst Valentinians as to whether the soulish could receive the gnosis and therefore receive a form of return to the one. But notice, proving God offered salvation to all. God offering salvation has a meaning for a provisionist that it didn't have for a Valentinian. Different meanings, different context. Certainly different for the Gnostic. But only the elect. There is no decree of elect that determines the identity of the elect. With freed wills could receive it. Freed wills from what? Valentinus taught it was Jesus that helped Adam and Eve to partake of the fruit. The Gnostic Basilides claimed initial faith itself was God's gift, as did numerous other people in that day. Paganism contributed to Plotinus's one, remained just and good by definition despite his inexplicable arbitrary injustice. Paganism contributed. It doesn't even make sense in English. It doesn't. I'm sorry. I'll read it again. Paganism contributed as Plotinus's one, remained just and good by definition despite his inexplicable arbitrary injustice. So, who's the his? I'd assume Plotinus's one, but it could be Plotinus. What did paganism contribute? Okay, divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies appears inevitable in any philosophy when a theory of totalitarian providence demands God must resurrect the totally incapacitated will, non-free free will, and infuse salvific faith as a gift of grace. Now, what's he describing here? He's describing Reformed theology. So what's he trying to do? He's trying to forge that connection. What's the result? He's taking his understanding and fabricating connections amongst categories that are completely disparate from one another foundationally, so as to create this idea of the connection via Augustine through to Reformed theology. Appears inevitable in any philosophy when a theory of totalitarian providence, I would assume that totalitarian providence is supposed to be something like Ephesians 1:11, works all things out of the counsel of his will. Psalm 135:6, Daniel 4. Is that what that's about? God's sovereign decree determining the very fabric of time, the Westminster Confession of Faith and London Baptist Confession of Faith, I would assume, demands God must resurrect the totally incapacitated will. You mean raised to spiritual life? Use biblical terminology, yes, raised to spiritual life. And freed from the slavery to sin, John 8. Yep, that's what the Son can do, definitely. And infuse salvific faith as a gift by grace, if that means regeneration, the making of a new heart, taking out a heart of stone, giving a heart of flesh. If what you're saying is infuse, would be the same thing as what we have in the prophets. I will take out a heart of stone. I will give you a heart of flesh. If that it has to be infused, I guess. It's strange terminology, but okay. Although Duped could perhaps theoretically be held without a micromanaging direct providence, starting with the latter assumption apparently predestines the position of divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destiny. That appeared 4 times in one paragraph. 3 times spelled out, and once as an acronym. I wonder how long this book would be if he had just used the acronym after the first time. probably been 20 pages shorter. Just simply would have been much cheaper to typeset. But although Dupid could perhaps theoretically be held without a micromanaging direct providence, so without a divine decree, starting with the latter assumption of what? Apparently predestines the position of Dupid. I'm just reading it, folks. And most of the time, it just don't make no sense. It's just so poorly written. But predictably, no ancient religion or philosophy dared deny free will. Creative philosophical manipulations provide a semblance of free will while denying its effective capacity. So, if you don't hold to full autonomy, then you can't ever use the term free will. You can't have creaturely free will. You can't have God has autonomous will and makes man with a creaturely free will. No, it's not really real. It's denying its effective capacity. Effective capacity, in other words, being fully autonomous. Even the strictest determinists retained the carcass of free will. Notice carcass of free will. There's nothing unbiased about this word. Although it had been gutted of meaningful choice as non-free free will. The public was not so gullible. Stoicism's declining popularity required Marcus Aurelius to finally soften its determinism. Heretical and pagan concepts of divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies with non-free free will were being confronted with freedom of choice by Christian authors. Dun, dun, dun. The Christians were coming with their autonomy. Well, except for those ones that we looked at earlier that believe in the elect. But anyway, not until circa 200 CE with Alexander of Aphrodisias, when we forget aphrodisiac, did the pagan debate progress to Judeo-Christian free will. Progress to Judeo-Christian free will. To progress to the level of it? To the substance of it? What? We're not told. He denounced Stoic and Neoplatonic determinism as impeding persons' moral development, argued for a genuine alternative choice and limited providence from controlling every detail of human action. Alexander forged a compromise between the two extremes of the Epicurean denial of any divine interference with the physical world and Stoic meticulous micromanaging providence, which again shouldn't have a providence with capital P because it's not personal. Judaism had previously held such a view. One might argue that in addition to Alexander's peripatetic objections to Stoic blending, prior Christians authors' philosophical refutations, Justin Martyr, Tatian, Irenaeus Clement, had influenced pagan theological debates by 200 CE. Christians vehemently opposed the deterministic Stoic, Gnostic, Neoplatonic, and Manichaean non-free free will. Well, you just said 200 CE. Mani was born then, so they hadn't opposed any Manichaeanism at this point. Early Christians emphatically rejected the divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies of heretics and pagans by hailing a Judeo-Christian residual freedom of choice in determining eternal destinies. Why? Because God's foreordination to salvation occurred through foreknowledge of a human faith response, as the next chapters will demonstrate. So there you have the thesis. There you have it laid out early on. This is a person who went into this study with an absolute fixed endpoint. I am going to prove that election is solely based upon God looking down the corridors of time and seeing what mankind's to do. There is no divine decree. And I am going to find divine decree in all the pagan religions, but not in Christianity. It's clear, compelling, very obvious. So what we'll do next time, which will not be tomorrow. No program tomorrow, sorry. I know we've been doing a lot of programs But just works out between Rich and I and stuff we're doing this weekend that's not going to happen. So we will be starting with the conclusion, which is on page 273. And working through the conclusion, once we're done with that, it should not take all that long if I can resist going into all the background issues with each thing. But in the process, I'll need to be producing the summary statement that we can then make available. Like I said, I encourage the translation of it, the posting of it, distribution of it. Just don't edit it. Just put it out there. We want your help to get it out there. I'd love to have a Spanish version of it and a German version of it. Wherever this kind of theory is being promoted as being some type of scholarship, we need to demonstrate that it's anything but serious scholarship when it comes to its conclusions. And then what are we going to do after we get done with this? I've forgotten. What did we used to do? Have you ever noticed if you have your Greek New Testament with you? I suppose it would be good to bring this over so that we can, so I can show you this. One of the, I was looking, since we did this quickly, I apologize. I wanted to be able to bring this up. I'll try to remember to do this before we go into the conclusion stuff on the Wilson dissertation. That is, reading through the conclusion. And by the way, if someone out there, this is a funny request to make. Sometimes when I work through a text or something like that, I can't remember whether I'm remembering my working through it or actually presenting it on the dividing line. So sometimes I've done work and then never presented it, which is a waste of time, obviously. Did I discuss Athanasius's writings about foreknowledge? Or at least the assertions that Wilson makes about Athanasius and foreknowledge. Maybe Chris would know, because Chris has been writing the articles and stuff, so maybe he's been keeping up with what I've covered. Because I have a whole section in my notes, and it's from the conclusion, so I'd be hitting it early on. But did I already talk about that? Did I already go back through and read? Because I pulled a bunch of Athanasius into the text to read it, and I just don't remember doing it on the program. I might have. And it's harder to go back and find that kind of stuff than you might think that it is. Someday computers will be able to do the voice to text thing so well. Because see, text to voice works really well. I mean, I use that constantly. Voice to text, not so much. At least not a couple of years ago when I tried it. Maybe it's getting better. But, Rich, can you imagine how useful it would be if we had a program that did voice to text, trained it on my voice, and then had searchable transcripts of the dividing lines? Yeah, that would be really, really awesome. And you're sitting there going, man, that'd be huge. Actually, in comparison to the video and audio files, it wouldn't be. It'd be tiny. But 1984? Oh, what the government would do with that? Well, it's already out there. There's no hiding from that, especially the way we do things. It's already out there. If they want evidence that I'm a Christian that believes God's law is righteous and good, and that Jesus is Lord over all, including the Chinese Communist Party and the United States government and all others, because he's King of Kings. They've got all the information. They've got all the evidence that they could possibly ever need. Not a problem on that. Anyways, that'd be a great thing to do. But that would also make it easier for me to go back and go, did I talk about that? And then just search for the last occurrence of Athanasius, and boing, there it is. And I go, oh yeah, I did. So one of the things that I want to track down is, because I know I got to the end of a program and I didn't do this. I had it queued up. I had the reference up. I didn't get to it. At least I don't think I got to it. I don't have any remembrance of doing it. Was a section from the dissertation where Wilson is saying that John Chrysostom had refuted this dupied interpretation of John 6:44. It might have been 6:65. And I was trying to grab it real quick before we got started, and I wasn't able to do so. I apologize. I'll try to get to it for next week. But that did get me thinking about the relationship of John 6:44 and John 6:65. And what's important, I think, for all of us, whether you have interest in the provisionists or anybody who has argumentation against Reformed theology, we know how important John 6 is. We have worked through it. I've lost track of how many times. We have dealt with some new, hyper-dispensational reading of John 6 or whatever. We've spent a lot of time on this kind of stuff. And one thing I assume everyone is aware of, but want to make sure we're aware of, is how John 6:65, being a restatement of John 6:44, helps us to establish a consistent and I really think unquestionable exegetical conclusion as to what is being said in the text. We've walked through it before. I'm not going to do it again, but we have a flow of the text that takes us from verse 37 through verse 39, emphasis upon the sovereignty of God. Verse 40 is the result of that in time. That is the result of God's work in man, is that we are looking to Christ, we're believing in Christ. Then you have the grumbling of the Jews through verse 43. And then in verse 44, we all know the text. No one is able to come to me unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him, and I will draw him, same him, I will raise him up on the last day, or in the last day. And the reality is that I think a lot of my Reformed brothers who are maybe younger in holding this particular position, it's always important to remember that any quote-unquote proof text we use is probably going to be even stronger in its testimony when you know the text in its context. This is especially true in John chapter 6, because 6:44 does not just sit there, stand on its own. And when you see its relationship to the next verse, this greatly enhances our argumentation. Because when we talk about no one can come to me unless the Father sent me, draws him, and we emphasize the power of the Father to draw to the Son, what we need to see is that verse 45 then expands that definition and helps us to understand with greater clarity. So, verse 45, it is written in the prophets, and then you have the quotation, they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So, comes to me is a concept that was already mentioned all the way back up in verse 37. All the Father gives me will come to me. So, God's teaching, they shall all be taught of God. The passive actions of hearing and learning from the Father, these are all expansions and explanations of how the drawing of the Father works. No one has the ability in and of themselves to come to Christ unless the Father draws him. Well, how does the Father draw him? Well, verse 45 tells us there is teaching, there is hearing, there is learning. And mankind is so focused upon defending our, how would I describe it? Our autonomy and our abilities and our powers, that when we hear this, we take everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me, and we endow hearing and learning with autonomous capabilities, rather than recognizing these are passive things. People are taught by God. They hear. When I hear something, I'm not, I suppose I could hear myself talking, but in this context, everyone who has heard from the Father, you didn't produce that revelation. And yet mankind will go, yeah, but I had to hear. And of course, in John, we know hearing, seeing, these are words that John uses regularly. Remember John chapter 9? The one who can't see is the one who can see. The people who can see can't see. It's meant to be that way. John chapter 8, Jesus is going to say, why can't you hear me? Because you're not of God. So, hearing is passive. Learning is passive. It's taking in knowledge from another source. Being taught by God, passive. So, what do you have in verse 45? You have actions of God. God teaches, God speaks, he reveals knowledge, and we simply hear and learn. And everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So this is descriptive. We often ask questions. What does regeneration involve? What does it look like? We want real specific scientific answers, So does the soul weigh a little bit more after regeneration? We want to get out our scales and our microscopes and stuff like that and be all scientific about it. But here you do have something that helps us to understand when it says the Father who sent me draws him. What's that drawing going to include? Well, we know that drawing is going to have certain results. And in this passage, they are infallible results. Everyone who's taught by God, everyone who's heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So this is a very specific, this isn't some general revelation. I mean, couldn't you argue on one level? Couldn't you say, well, everyone has learned from the Father because God created the universe, and therefore there's general revelation, and men know that God exists, but they suppress that knowledge, but still they've learned stuff, and so, but that's obviously not what Jesus is referring to. He's referring to a specific, salvific, effective, divine action. This is why you can go to John 10, and what's Jesus going to say? My sheep hear my voice. My sheep hear my voice. There is a personal relationship there. There has been truth about who Jesus is that has been communicated to that person who is now a sheep. But that sheep was chosen by the shepherd. The sheep didn't choose the shepherd. So the text is so clear in emphasizing the divine capacity, the divine power, that it is very, very educational to us to see how man will try to get around that and try to turn these texts into affirming human free will. But we've seen people do it. We've seen Norman Geisler do it. We've seen John Lennox do it. smart folks, but so wedded to human autonomy that they'll actually see texts that are talking about divine autonomy in explicit terms and somehow find a way to turn them into texts teaching human autonomy. But don't forget, I think our conversations with others, when we go to John 6, and John 6 is an extremely useful and effective text to go to, our conversations will be greatly enhanced if we don't just stop at verse 44. But then we explain that verse 45 then helps us to understand better what this involves, what this drawing of the Father involves, and that it's effective. It accomplishes that which God intends it to accomplish. And the result of this communication of knowledge, in provisionism, remember, grace, as I understand how Leighton Flowers has expressed it, grace is found in the gospel. The gospel itself is gracious. God did not have to do what he did, but he did, so that's where the grace is found. That's why you don't need prevenient grace, is the grace is found in the gospel itself. Mankind has the capacity in and of itself. There's no udais dunatai in provisionism. Udais dunatai means no one is able. There's no udais dunatai in provisionism. Everyone has that capacity. Hence, the gospel comes, and there is knowledge of what Jesus claims, and it's up to the human individual to make the decision one way or the other, and then God acts based upon that, acts based upon his foreknowledge of what those human beings do. There's all sorts of theological problems with that, but that's the theory. Well, here's the problem. In John 6:45, everyone who is taught of God, everyone who hears the message, everyone who's learned from the Father comes to Christ. So, again, you're either a universalist or you're reformed, because this communication of knowledge is effective. There is no one to whom the Father has revealed this knowledge that does not come to Christ. So the only two logical results from that is you either need to recognize the existence of the elect or you become a universalist. The autonomous choice just simply isn't there. It doesn't fit. So memorize verse 45 along with verse 44. Very, very important. But then, and this is what caused me to start thinking about all this, in a number of the references in the dissertation, you would have, if it was a direct reference John 6:65, there'd be a comparison to 6:44, or vice versa, or they both be cited together. And that's because they say so much of the same thing, but 65 is a summary statement later on, after the discussion of eating the flesh and drinking the blood, which is not a separate discussion. This is the other thing. If, for example, you have Roman Catholic relatives, friends, co-workers, whatever, you're not going to be able, I don't believe you're going to be able to address in a contextual, consistent format what Jesus is talking about when he talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, until you see how that is related to what came before. Because what is in verses 37 and following, the high sovereignty of God, predestination, election, it's right there. That's the context of Jesus emphasizing his own centrality and what believing in him actually means, connecting it back to the Passover and the giving of the bread of life, etc., etc. If you don't see that everything that God does, like in verse 45, is so that his people come to Christ, and that eating his flesh and drinking his blood communicates to us his absolute centrality. We're not trying to join Jesus with a bunch of other things. That's what's so reprehensible about Union Theological Seminary and all quote-unquote inclusivistic deformations of the Christian faith. It's about Jesus. That's an exclusive claim. Try to add other stuff in there and you no longer have Christianity. When you are continuously coming to Christ, that's what you see in the supper. Because the supper, every time you partake of the supper, you're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes, right? Proclaim the Lord's death in what context? That this is your only hope. That only by union with him, only by his death, only by his resurrection, only by his broken body and blood, do you have any hope at all. That's what was so horrible about the syncretistic religion in Israel when they would build the high places, the Asherim, the Baals, is because so many of these people would offer the sacrifices at the tabernacle or the temple and then go to the Baals. We frequently do the same thing now, not seeing the absolutely exclusivistic nature of the message of the gospel itself. So that becomes very important in looking at the rest of that. But I want you to see this right here. Udais dunatai elthine pros me. So no one is able to come pros me. Eon, unless, so we're in the subjunctive here, no one is able to come to me unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him. So eon me, conditional form, and so no one, dunatai, has the capacity, elthine, to come, pros me. And you may notice this little thing right here. That's just simply, there's a minor textual variant there where some manuscripts, specifically Vaticanus and a few other uncials, have a epsilon there. It changes. This is just in passing. This is one of those textual variants that has no impact on meaning, which is what the vast majority of textual variants are. That's just an alternate way of writing the direct object form of the pronoun here. And so some people did. So there was an epsilon in some and not in others. That's all it is. But so many variants are exactly that. So do you see that? No one is able to come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Now, let's go down to the 665. So, now, this is after, but there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe, and who it was that would betray him. Now, there's all sorts of stuff. We could stop right there. We could say, does that fit into a provisionist understanding or a reformed understanding? Because, hey, it says he knew who would believe, so that's just simple divine foreknowledge. But could they have not believed? And what about Judas? Isn't the role of Judas prophesied? And is that just simply God looking down the corridors of time? Is that what prophecy is? Or does Judas have, is he not laid, he is set out as the son of perdition? Couldn't he have chosen to do otherwise? How do you answer that? Could he have chosen to do otherwise? Could he have invalidated divine prophecy? If you say that he has autonomous free will, you have a real hard time with this whole thing, because that's why open theists will actually say, well, that's right, he could have changed everything. Might not have been the cross. It might have been some other way that God had to do it. Anyway, so then you have in verse 65, and he was saying, now what's interesting here is this is the imperfect. And the imperfect is an interesting form in the original language. Syntactically, there are a couple ways it can be. There's inceptive imperfects and ingressive and continuous, and you start getting a little bit more of a subjective thing. Not subjunctive thing. That got really confusing. A subjective interpretation at that point. We start getting the syntax, but generally, what the imperfect is doing is talking about an action that was ongoing for a period of time in the past. It doesn't emphasize a start. It can, but it doesn't. That would be something that would be derived from the context, or maybe the verb that was being used, something like that. But the point is, in this instance, Jesus repeated himself. He had said it in verse 44. He says it, and then 65 tells us he was saying this more than once. In other words, we know that his teaching in the synagogue of Capernaum lasted longer than it takes to read John chapter 6, beginning at verse 35 or verse 30 or so. That doesn't take very long. So obviously, there were many, many, many more words spoken in that context. So what we're being told is that there was a emphasized or repeated element to Jesus' teaching. And that emphasized or repeated element was, for he was saying, dia tuta, for this reason, ireka. So I said to you, he's pointing back to that first reference in verse 44. So the point is, Jesus himself teaches that he was repeating the emphasis that he made in verse 44. Sometimes we're told, you put too much emphasis on John 6:44. Well, Jesus did. Jesus repeated himself. So, for this reason, I said to you, then look at what comes in. That, udais, dunatai, elthine, pros, me, aeon me. Look familiar? It's identical from verse 44. Identical. No one is able to come to me unless eon me. And now here's where we get a little more light shed on the topic by having this repetition, this repeated element later on in the chapter, because the rest of the verse is different than what you have in verse 44. So, no one is able to come to me unless it has been given to him from the Father. So, can we learn something from the different way that John records these words? Because what's the difference? Well, here, unless it has been given to him by the Father, you go up to 44, and it says, unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him. So, granting to someone, it has been given to him by the Father, and being drawn by the Father are the same thing. They're the same thing. So, granted to him, given to him, again, that's a divine act. It's a divine act. And yet, so many would try to tell us that that is a provisional act. That is an attempt on God's part. God is attempting to do something. So drawing in the synergistic concept is an attempt on God's part. He's trying to make something happen. He wants something to happen, but he can't necessarily accomplish it in and of himself. Or it's his purpose to simply make it, to provide it, provisionism, and then it's up to man. Right? So how do you understand that in light of the fact that 644 and 665 are meant to explicate each other? 665 adds the information that to be drawn by the Father, according to verse 44, if you're drawn by the Father, you'll be raised up on the last day by the Son. According to 665, you can't come to the Son unless it has been granted to you by the Father. If it's granted you by the Father, then you'll be given to the Son, and the Son will not lose you. The Father will draw you to the Son will raise you up on the last day. That's called election and predestination. That is personal. That's not some nameless, faceless group. This is the clear, consistent, I'm using the exact same exegetical methodology in looking at this that I use when looking at James chapter 2, which we did just last week, that I use in defending the deity of Christ in Colossians 1 and 2, that I use to defend the resurrection, that I use in responding to Bart Ehrman's claims that John has Jesus crucified on a different day. We're using the same exegetical methodology, which is why when we play the Radio Free Geneva theme, one of the sections in there is when I asked Leighton Flowers during our debate, are you using the same exegetical methodology to come to that conclusion that we would utilize in other texts of Scripture regarding the resurrection or things like that? Well, no. That's the end of the debate. When you say, well, no, Rich just... You know, I don't think I've used one of these in forever. He just found one of these. He's going like this and the other. I surrender. It's done. That's right. That's how you do it in the debate. Is the other guy goes, so are you using a different way of interpreting Scripture now than you'd use anywhere else? And if you go, well, yeah. Okay, so do we have refreshments ready? Yeah, that's right. Yep, that's right. And so seeing these things, seeing the parallel language, following the context, all of this stuff, it's just simply how you deal with the text of Scripture all the way through. And when you do that in John 6, you see that the Father is the one who draws, based upon having that and that's to be understood as it has been granted to that person. And then when you tie that back together, 6:37-39, all the Father gives me will come to me. And I've not come down out of heaven to do my own will, the will of him who sent me, and this is the will of him who sent me, that of all that he has given to me, I lose nothing, but raise it up on the last day. 6:44, I'll raise it up on the last day. Wow, it's a consistent text. Powerfully consistent. And that's why when you listen to people trying to come up with a way around it, sometimes it's just painful. It is painful for me to listen to a brother who, if we were 2 chapters later, if we were literally only a couple dozen verses later in John chapter 8, and we're getting toward the end, the climax of John chapter 8, and the anger and the emotion is getting hot. And Jesus not only knows it, but he's pressing their buttons. And we look at that text, and many of my brothers, I'm thinking of some people right now, would walk lockstep with me through those verses that identify Jesus as Yahweh. Jesus as the I am. Prin Abraham Genesai, ego I me, before Abraham was, I am. And we'd use the same methods of exegesis to come to the conclusion that Jesus is the I am. But then when you apply the exact same methodology to John 6, all of a sudden things change. That's how strong tradition can be. That's how strong a commitment to some kind of human autonomy can be. That you can see it right there. The words are the same. It's consistent all the way through, but just simply refuse to see it. So I was just thinking about this because I said earlier, I wish I had been able to pull that up. I thought I had pulled that quote out. You know, sometimes you go, yeah, I'll pull it out and I'll deal with it here. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I can search. Oh. Well, I didn't pull it out. That's pretty neat. Isn't it fun how sometimes you'll find a feature that you didn't have? In this, I'm using a program called Ulysses. And Ulysses is a cloud-based word processor. So when I write stuff on my phone or at home, whatever, it just automatically updates, and so I've got it wherever. And so I have a Wilson stuff folder in Ulysses, and that's where I'm putting all this stuff. And you can just do a search, and it'll search all your cloud-based stuff and just pull it up for you. But unfortunately, there's nothing about... Yeah, see, I just put in Athanasius. Athanasius popped up, so bummer. But I wish I wish I had the reference. I had it queued up for a couple days, and I just kept forgetting to do it. Where Chrysostom tries to deal with John 6:44 in a synergistic fashion, and just doesn't even come close to providing a meaningful refutation at all. Now, did any of you catch that in all that conversation that I just provided, I never talked about emanations? I didn't talk about sparks of light. I made no reference to the fact that I had breakfast on the way in, and therefore I am, as one of the elect, providing salvation for the light particles that were in the food that I ate, that will now be freed to go up to the Milky Way, and then from the Milky Way to the moon, and from the moon to the sun, and from the sun back to the realm of light. Because we all know that I am, in fact, a Manichaean. Yes, yes. Yes, oh, of course. But, well, it's right here. And the greatest dissertation ever written from Oxford. And everyone at Oxford tells me that, too. It's just, we've never seen anything like this. Well, actually, they haven't ever seen anything like it. But that's for another reason. So, did you not catch where in all that discussion of imperfects and subjunctives and parallel phraseology and everything else that we were just doing in John chapter 6, that in fact that was all dependent upon a worldview where there is no personal revelatory God, and where, well, okay, some of you are automatically going, but wait a minute, you're married with kids, you're not one of the elect. Well, yeah, that is a problem. You get my point? There was nothing in what I spent half an hour or more talking with you about from John chapter 6 that requires any element any connection, any influence by anything related to Manichaeism or Gnosticism, Valentinian or Sethian, not to Porphyry or Plotinus, in any of the Neoplatonic schools. I didn't have to quote anything from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there were no Stoics to be found anywhere. And that's because the real issue about the freedom of God in salvation is first and foremost a biblical one. And I don't believe that the provisionist side can provide any meaningful refutation of the exegesis that we just offered. And so I see this entire feint on the part of the provisionist as a means of getting us off into the weeds. And I'm certainly, hey, I brought my weed whacker, and so we can just cut the weeds down and expose what's going on in there. But I mentioned yesterday, and I'll just be brief on this. You know, when I play that one clip, the context of it is Leighton Flowers saying, well, in light of what you said, well, what he's been saying is about what the early church allegedly said. But then Leighton's immediate application is their interpretation of these texts is untenable and indefensible. So the early church becomes the lens through which the New Testament is to be read. That's interesting. We deal with a lot of folks like that. They just generally don't call themselves Baptists of any stripe whatsoever, because they're generally not. So the whole idea that, well, if you're a Calvinist, you're just a Manichaean anyways, is clearly just an attempt to get around the fact that when it comes down to the nitty-gritty examination of the text, we saw how that worked out in 2015. We've seen how that's worked out a number of times since then as we've looked at John chapter 8, Romans chapter 8, and provided extensive answers and refutations to provisionist scholars. And what do we keep seeing? Oh, they'll quote sources, but they won't deal with those sources in a meaningful fashion. The quotations will be highly problematic. I'm not just talking about Wilson at that point. There are other people in the southwestern region of the United States that have that issue as well.
You shouldn't be afraid to think about the wonder that is Mary. St. Augustine, in the 400s, said, he whom, talking about Christ.
I'm sure this came from the Manichaeans, just to bring in some other theories while we're at it.
Second person.
And I know we've got to finish up the Wilson stuff and stuff like that. I sort of burned down on it for a while, to be honest with you. How do we know it's there? We can't see it. There's all this dust in the way. That's what the Milky Way is. It's unlike the Manichaeans. It's whole nother topic there. Yep, another hour to go. Unlike the Manichaeans, that's not where the light is returning to the realm of light. No, that's a lot of stars and dust that is the rest of our galaxy. You can fall off on this side to where it's all chaos, and there's no connectedness, there's no unity, there's no coherence. The other side, though, the one which is where the human mind wants to go, because the human mind wants coherence and connection, is to absorb everything into one. And so you see it in a lot of man's religions. You saw it in Manichaeism. You saw it in Gnosticism. You see it in the idea that salvation is getting freed from this physical realm of things in being absorbed back into the one. You cannot understand the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception if you do not understand the concept of original sin as enunciated by and taught by Augustine. which tells you something. If you're going to say it goes all the way back to the apostles, then those people saying that nobody before Augustine believed in original sin have a problem. And I know at least one individual who promotes both Ken Wilson and this stuff. They don't fit. They don't. You can't do both of them. And she loved with redemption and guarded with kindness and declared with grandeur. Hallelujah. Now, I think it is important to recognize some of that terminology. Only a few of you who are still awake at this point did. And you did because you were listening carefully to the Ken Wilson response. Because the language of the great power and other phraseology that's used there comes straight out of Gnosticism, and hence finds place even in Manichaeism as well because of the Gnostic influence. But that's where it comes from. None of this comes from the worldview of Scripture. None of it comes from the apostles. It comes from outside of Scripture. You don't do church history like this. You should know better. Were you asleep during church history? You don't take people... This is what Dave Hunt does to Augustine. This is what Ken Wilson does to Augustine. It's what everybody does to Augustine. Let's drag Augustine out of his context, put him into a modern context, and condemn him for whatever it is we're looking to condemn him for. This is easy. This is simplistic church history, and it is reprehensible for anyone to call themselves a scholar and to engage in that kind of thing.